82 passengers and staff are on board an Icelandair Boeing 757 as it makes its final approach to Oslo, Norway. The aircraft abruptly dips down and dives directly toward the Earth. As the engines scream and the passengers are hauled out of their seats, pandemonium breaks out on board. The pilots are in a panic since they don't know what's going on inside their plane. Before time runs out, will they be able to save it from its frightening plunge? This is the Flight 315 of Icelandair narrative. At Reykjavik Airport in Iceland, 75 passengers and 7 crew members boarded an Icelandair Boeing 757 early on January 22, 2002. They had 2 hours to go to reach Oslo, the capital of Norway. The official airline of the nation should have operated the trip just like any other. There was nothing unusual about the route, the weather, or the aircraft. Both pilots had a lot of experience. However, even if the weather and the airplane had an impact on what happened next, this is ultimately not their narrative. In actuality, Icelandair Flight 315 is an amazing case study on human psychology and the decision-making processes of individuals under duress. It's a tale of how seemingly little setbacks may take someone down a road they never planned to go. The 43-year-old captain of this flight has been flying since 1986 for Icelandair. He had accrued slightly over 8,000 flying hours at this period, most of them on this Boeing 757. The first cop had less background. He was 26 years old and had flown for Icelandair for the preceding 3 years, totaling slightly under 2,500 hours of flight service. The Icelandair captain had a lot of experience flying after this trip. As the strain increased, serious issues would be raised regarding the manner in which these pilots collaborated. As the journey continues, we'll investigate this more thoroughly. They were piloting a Boeing 757, which was 3 years old. This airplane, which had a high degree of safety and redundancy in its onboard equipment, was still comparatively recent in 2002. Being among the most powerful passenger aircraft ever constructed, the plane was greatly adored by its pilots. Because of how much power pilots could pull out of its engines, it was lovingly referred to as the pocket rocket by many. However, the pilots would get assistance from more than just their engines throughout their journey. A strong tailwind would cut several minutes off their scheduled flying time. However, this would prove to be more of a hindrance than a benefit as the team got closer to Oslo. That morning, at around 20 minutes after 7, Flight 315 backed out of the Reykjavik gate and started to pull out onto the runway. The travelers got comfortable for the trip. It would only take them 2 hours to reach Norway. The pilot aligned the aircraft with the runway at 25 to 8 and activated the formidable Rolls-Royce engines for takeoff thrust. The chilly climes of Iceland were quickly replaced by the cold climes of Norway as the jet shot upward in a matter of seconds. The flight proceeded normally en route. As the aircraft traveled east, passengers seated near the windows were treated to a breathtaking picture of the rising sun. This perspective was also provided to the pilots. But when they got closer to Oslo, they realized the weather would not be ideal. When the plane was 200 nautical miles from Oslo at 20:10 that morning, the pilots tuned into the weather report from the airport. Runway 01 right, which faces northwest, was in service. As was usual in Oslo in the winter, there was likely to be fog throughout the approach and landing. There was an overcast cloud ceiling at 500 feet and scattered clouds as low as 200 feet above the ground. There was just 1,000 meters of sight, and more significantly, a 20-knot tailwind, or about 40 kilometers / all the way down to only 200 feet above the runway. Stated differently, the crew would need to give this strategy their whole focus. It wouldn't be until the very last moments before landing that they could see the runway. In addition to setting up their navigational aids and instruments, the pilots had an approach briefing in preparation for landing on runway 01 directly at Oslo. The pilots were cool and in charge of the aircraft at this stage in the journey. They were getting the aircraft set up nice and early so that their burden would not be too high when they approached the airport, even though they were still a few minutes away from starting the descent. They were allowed to fly one of the regular arrivals into the airport by air traffic control 10 minutes later. After entering this into their flight management system, the pilots started to descend. The crew knew that a tailwind had been predicted for much of their approach as they dropped. When pilots mention a tailwind, passengers nearly always interpret this as a good thing. It indicates that they plan to arrive earlier than expected. However, the truth is that while a tailwind is quite beneficial when traveling, it may cause issues as the aircraft gets closer to the airport. For pilots, the descent and approach are the busiest times. Setting up the aircraft for a smooth landing requires a lot of work, particularly in low visibility. The jet will reach the airport more quickly than normal if there is a tailwind. This implies that the pilots now have to complete all of their pre-landing chores, including the actual descent, in a much shorter period of time. Furthermore, the tailwinds were much greater than expected by the Flight 315 pilots. They reached speeds of up to 140 kmph, or 75 knots. Although the pilots were originally aware of the tailwind, what happened next would quickly cause them to lose knowledge of it. Air traffic control gave the pilots a shortcut as they descended. Direct clearance to one of the checkpoints located further along their arrival path was given to them. Once again, both pilots and passengers often see shortcuts as beneficial. However, the crew of Flight 315 was unaware that taking this shortcut would have a significant impact on their capacity to properly land the aircraft. Then, some unfavorable news was radioed to the pilots by air traffic control. There was snow on the runway where they were supposed to land. Although snow trucks were sent to remove it, they wouldn't be done by the time Flight 315 arrived at the runway. The controller then instructed the pilots to land on runway 01 left, which is the parallel runway. The already hectic pilot's workload increased as a result of this last-minute change in schedule. They needed to tune in the ILS frequency for the new runway, set up their flight management computer for the arrival at runway 01 left, and then brief the approach jointly. Throughout the whole flight, the aircraft was propelled by an air current that was far greater than the one that was predicted. The pilots were so focused on getting the aircraft ready for its new approach that they failed to notice how strong the tailwind had become. The pilots were now rising on their descending profile as a result of this, and the previous shortcuts they had been given. This is how the situation seemed to the pilots of Flight 315. They were in profile at the beginning of the drop, neither too high nor too low. But because of a tailwind, they were able to reach the runway more quickly, which made their optimal fall profile higher. This implied that they would not reach the runway in time if they dropped at their regular pace. The pilots would thus need to drop more quickly in order to keep up with the steepness of their revised descent profile. And this is what they did at first. However, they were given still another shortcut when they got closer to the airport, which cut down on their travel time even further. Their perfect descending profile was now considerably more pronounced. It was almost a given. A drift above the descending profile was noticed by Flight 315. The intriguing aspect of this trip, however, and the reason for the subsequent occurrences, is this. Never has an aircraft crashed because it descended too quickly. Pilots have to care about the ground, not the air. The answer to the crew's dilemma was as simple as it was obvious. To lower altitude, all they needed to do was inform the controller that they required a few more kilometers. However, the pilots never carried out this action because to the self-imposed pressure to reach the runway, sometimes referred to as get there-itis in aviation. They drove too quickly and too high toward Oslo. This descent seemed to be just another one to the people in the rear of the plane. But there was pressure in the cockpit. In an effort to accelerate the plane's descent, the pilot engaged the speed brakes. Their impact was little. The aircraft was still too aloft. In situations such as these, the problem may have been resolved by only one pilot taking a step back, assessing the circumstances, and informing the other pilot that they had an even better choice. That was only to add a few kilometers to their route to the runway. Since it was introduced to pilot training in the 1980s and 1990s, crew resource management, a term used to describe this kind of cooperation, has saved thousands of lives on passenger airplanes. However, this crucial safety measure malfunctioned as a result of the extreme strain the pilots had placed themselves under. It was a never-ending loop. The need to reach the airport promptly resulted in a breakdown in crew resource management, which in turn generated further pressure, worsened crew resource management, and so on. Now, every pilot was doing his job in his own environment. Their collaborative efforts had ceased. This lack of cooperation would have disastrous effects and endanger everyone's life on board in a matter of minutes. Air Traffic Control approved Flight 315 to intercept the ILS for runway 01 left at 10:45 that morning. Pilots utilized the Instrument Landing System, ILS, to precisely approach the runway in poor visibility conditions. Two beams make up the ILS, which projects a virtual route for aircraft to follow from the runway's surface. The vertical element is one of these beams, the horizontal component, known as the localizer, and the vertical component, known as the glide slope. Each of these is shown on the pilot's attitude direction indicator of the Boeing 757 as purple symbols. The glide slope is represented by this purple symbol, while the plane is represented by this rectangle. The aircraft is now above the glide slope. Similarly, the localizer is represented by this purple symbol, which indicates that the plane is now to the left of it. The skipper would be able to maintain the purple ILS signals aligned with the aircraft by pitching the aircraft up and down and rotating it left and right. He would emerge from the clouds at 200 feet, precisely aligned with the runway, if he continued in this manner all the way to the Earth. However, this was the point at which the pilot's prior self-imposed strain truly began to wear out. Because of the strong tailwind, they were traveling considerably faster than usual and remained high on the descending profile. This meant that the autopilot was unable to turn rapidly enough to align the aircraft with the runway when the plane intercepted the localizer. The plane had to circle around and re-intercept it from the other side after overshooting the center line. When the aircraft was finally aligned with the runway, the controller allowed the aircraft to descend to a height of 2,500 feet. The pilots dropped the landing gear and kept falling. They were still elevated, however. The autopilot was having a hard time getting the jet down onto the glide slope because of how quickly the tailwind was driving them towards the runway. You may be thinking at this point that it would have been prudent for the pilots to reverse course and land in the other direction. Planes are designed to land into the wind after all. However, one peculiarity of the Earth's atmosphere is that the wind changes with height. At an altitude of around 3,000 feet, Flight 315 encountered a 45-knot tailwind. There was a little breeze on the runway. Furthermore, the wind on the runway is the only wind that counts during takeoff and landing. The pilots so carried on with their approach. However, the pilot was starting to have doubts about the autopilot's capability to get the aircraft down to the glide slope. It was just not acting with enough aggression. He then unhooked it and started operating the aircraft by himself. In an attempt to level his aircraft with a purple glide sign that stubbornly stayed under him, he shoved the nose down. With his right hand on the throttles and his left on the control column, he was grappling the plane to the ground. Getting the airplane into the glide slope was his only focus. However, an odd event occurred, something that would cause the pilot to lose his equilibrium for the duration of the flight. On the captain's display, the icons for the ILS just disappeared. At this point, the captain was unsure of his location with regard to the runway. He didn't want to drop too much thus low to the Earth, so he cautiously pushed up on his control column. But the symbols returned a few seconds later. Even though the aircraft was still high, the pilot persisted, trying to catch the glide sub from above with what is called a slam dunk approach by pulling the nose back down. This continued for a little while until the captain's idle symbols vanished once again. When he informed the first officer, the officer noted that his instruments were operating as intended. It would have been wise for the captain to give the first officer control at this time, since it seemed like his instruments were working well. But he went on instead. It would take the plane little over a minute to touch down. The jet continued to fly fast and high even as the ILS signals came back. Neither pilot spoke as it dropped below 1,000 feet. At this height, according to standard protocol, the pilot not in flight, in this instance the first officer, is required to report if the aircraft has stabilized on approach, meaning it is completely on the ILS and prepared for landing. The pilots must terminate the approach if the aircraft is not stabilized during the 1,000-foot approach. However, during their hasty descent, the two pilots' coordination broke out, and the first officer never announced this. The landing checklist had not been followed. The aircraft was flying quickly and at a high altitude, and the flaps had not yet been adjusted for landing. This was the epitome of an unstable strategy, and there were going to be dire repercussions for all those involved. The captain lost patience at 600 feet above the ground, but the pilots persisted. The aircraft was still not going to slide onto the glide slope. He said that he was making his rounds. He activated the go-around switches on the throttles and raised the plane's nose. The aircraft started to ascend as the motor spooled up. The skipper kept pitching the nose up until it was 20 degrees over the horizon after the first officer upped the gear. This round had been uneventful so far, but now the pilot's careless approach would cost them horribly. They had never set the autopilot for the missed approach altitude since they had never finished the before-landing checklist. As a result, they had set 2,500 feet instead of 4,000 feet, which was the last height the controller had given them. They blasted over this height rapidly since they were climbing swiftly, and the autopilot cut the engine's thrust output when they did. Now, instead of giving the aircraft the go-around power it needed to rise, it was going for the speed of just 150 knots, the speed the pilots had originally chosen for their approach. The pace was dropping very quickly. If the captain took no action, the aircraft would stall and plummet from the sky. When he realized this, he swiftly leveled down the aircraft by pushing down its nose. Almost everyone on board was startled out of their chairs by this abrupt, dramatic movement. However, for some reason, after leveling the aircraft, the captain kept pushing the nose down without pausing. As the aircraft descended into near wakelessness, one passenger, who had not been wearing his seatbelt, was hoisted up out of his seat. Mobile phones and spectacles were pulled from shirt pockets of strapped passengers. As the aircraft plummeted, magazines and newspapers flew off of their racks and water from the toilets sprayed up into the bathroom ceiling. Charts and briefcases took to the air in the cockpit. Now the nose of the airplane was angled more than 40 degrees below the horizon. With its engines blazing, the aircraft was gaining incredible speed as it descended into the earth. The travelers let out horrified screams. The captain did not know where he was. His instruments were telling him precisely what was going on, but he was having trouble understanding them. Boom went the aircraft's computerized voice across the cockpit. Their plane would crash into the earth in a couple of seconds at a speed of almost 450 kilometers/a if neither pilot took action. The first police officer said, "What are you doing? Please get up." A frantic attempt was made by both pilots to lift the airplane out of its scary plunge by yanking back forcefully on its control columns. The aircraft struggled to break out of its fast dive and moaned under the G-forces. A force of 3.5 Gs was applied to compel everyone on board into their chairs. Anyone who weighs 80 kilograms usually would feel like they weigh 280 kilograms, since this is that powerful. The enormous G-forces were also pushing both pilots into their seats as they wrenched ferociously at the controls. When the plane's plunge eventually bottomed out, It was little over 300 feet from the crash and started to ascend. However, this was no typical ascent. The pilots allowed the jet to pitch a full 40 degrees nose up because they were still reeling from the dive and were having trouble keeping up with their aircraft. With the autothrottle slamming the thrust levers all the way forward, the aircraft struggled to maintain its speed as it ascended quickly. The pilot eventually stabilized the aircraft as it shot up to the left of the G-forces in a matter of seconds. He was still shook, however. Like a wild horse, his aircraft had gotten out in front of him. After gently guiding the airplane to 4,000 feet, the pilot leveled off. As they returned to the cabin, the guests were stunned. While some were in tears, others were in prayer. What had transpired was completely unknown to everyone. Similar to the passenger compartment, the cockpit was disorganized, with manuals, charts, and loose documents all over the place. There was little time for the pilots to absorb what had occurred or why. Air traffic control was notified by the first officer that they were making a missed approach, but they were not made aware of the severe maneuver that had just taken place or the proximity to the collision. The pilot's vectors were returned by the controller for an alternative approach. In the meanwhile, the pilot briefed the passengers, informing them that the approach had failed and that they would be returning in 10 minutes. The pilots made a full loop and aligned themselves with the runway once again. They stabilized their approach this time. Everything looked normal again, and they were on the glide slope. However, the captain's ILS readings vanished from his instruments once again. This time, he was not going to take any risks. He gave the runway full control right away. The pilots were as shocked as everyone else on board. Many of the passengers in the front of the aircraft would subsequently discover their reading glasses and cell phones toward the rear of the aircraft due to the forceful movement. It's odd that the pilots neglected to inform the passengers of what had just happened during their debriefing. When the aircraft had parked at the gate, the passengers just got out. After tidying up the cockpit, the pilots held a conversation with the flight attendants, outlining the events that had occurred. However, they were still unable to identify the initial reason of the violent maneuver. Upon learning about the occurrence and starting to look into this peculiar sequence of events, detectives were also unable to make sense of it. Why in the world would a seasoned pilot choose to deliberately lower the nose of his aircraft during a go-around? The somatographic illusion, a potent psychological phenomena, is one reason for the captain's behavior. The brain's inability to distinguish between acceleration and the body being orientated up causes this illusion. It may be seen in this manner. In an automobile, you are forced back into your seat as you speed. However, going uphill might also force you back into your seat. It feels nearly exactly the same. When driving, it's simple to determine which is occurring because of the view via the window. However, while flying in clouds, the only way to determine whether you're climbing or accelerating is to consult your instruments, especially the attitude direction indicator. Therefore, by determining what the aircraft was doing immediately before the captain pushing the nose down, we may be able to provide an explanation for his actions. It turns out that as soon as the jet started to speed, he shoved the nose down. It's possible that the captain mistook this acceleration for the aircraft pitching up when it was in the clouds, to which he replied by pushing the nose downward. The powerful G-forces and the speed at which everything had transpired had left him so dazed that he was unable to interpret the signals from his equipment, which indicated that he was now plummeting directly for the Earth. Although the reason of the captain's actions has never been established, this would not be the first time a pilot has acted in such a manner due to a somatographic delusion. Over the years, hundreds of passenger deaths have been attributed to this phenomena. Although the first officer in this instance came to the rescue at the last second, the situation really shouldn't have escalated to this degree in the first place. This was all a result of several bad choices made by the crew early in the flight, which occurred as a result of a complete collapse in crew resource management. This episode is scary because of how simply and rapidly it happened, and how likely it was to happen again. What had really happened was that a very skilled staff had made a few very human errors that left them open to making further blunders. Investigators advised that in light of this, both Icelandair and the aviation community should reassess the protocols for abandoned approaches. Additionally, it suggested that the Norwegian Civil Aviation Authority take into account the impact of air traffic control, reducing approaches in poor visibility situations, particularly for airline crew members who may have minimal prior experience with Oslo. That January 2002 morning, Flight 315 came perilously close to disaster. However, pilot training now includes the crew resource management and approach planning lessons learned from this near catastrophe, increasing air safety. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never missed out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.